One night changed everything. She got pregnant, and the cold CEO became a devoted daddy. Welcome, my beautiful family. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. Whether you're a long-time supporter or you're joining us for the first time, I'm so incredibly grateful to have you with me on this journey. Every view, every comment, and every subscription means the world to me. You are not just viewers. You are my inspiration, my strength, and my heart. In this space, we're more than just a channel. We're a community of dreamers, believers, and lovers. You've brought so much light into my life, and I'm honored to share this experience with you. To those who have been with me from the start, thank you for your unwavering support. You've made this all possible, and I will forever be thankful. I'm so excited to share everything we have in store. Together, we'll create something beautiful. I want you to know that no matter where life takes you, you are always enough. You are loved, you are worthy, and you are capable of anything. My heart is with you in every video, every story, and every step we take on this adventure. May love fill your days. May joy fill your heart. And may you always remember that you are part of something truly special here. Thank you for making this journey so unforgettable. Let's create memories. Let's share love. And above all, let's continue to grow together. I love you all, and I'm sending you my warmest blessings. Now, let's get started on today's adventure. Together, Mia Carter sat alone in the dimly lit lounge of the five-star hotel, her fingers curling around the stem of a half-empty wine glass. The city lights sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden hues over her trembling form. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. She had finally walked away from a toxic relationship, from a man who had never truly loved her. But instead of relief, a deep loneliness gnawed at her, an aching void that not even the strongest drink could fill. Her head tilted slightly when she felt an intense gaze on her. Across the room, Nicholas Knight sat in his usual poised manner, his sharp grey eyes locked onto her. His presence was magnetic, his aura commanding. The billionaire CEO was known for his ruthlessness in the business world, his name synonymous with power, wealth, and an icy detachment that made people both fear and admire him. They had met before, briefly. She was a struggling designer trying to make a name for herself, and he was the untouchable king of the corporate world. But tonight, something was different. There was something raw in his gaze, something dark and inviting. Mia had no intention of entertaining him. Nicholas Knight was the last person she needed in her life, yet when he stood and walked toward her, she found herself frozen, her pulse hammering. Drinking alone? His voice was deep, velvety, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. She scoffed. "What does it look like?" Nicholas arched a brow. "It looks like you're trying to forget something." Mia exhaled sharply. "Maybe I am." There was a long pause before he said, "So am I." She wasn't sure who leaned in first, who breached the invisible line between them. But suddenly, they were no longer two strangers in a hotel bar. The air between them sizzled with unspoken desires, with wounds neither wanted to acknowledge. "I should go," Mia whispered, but the words were weak, lacking conviction. Nicholas studied her for a moment before extending a hand. "Come with me." Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the loneliness, or maybe it was the way his voice wrapped around her like a silken promise. But she placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her toward the elevator. The ride up was suffocatingly silent, yet the tension between them was unbearable. When the doors opened to his penthouse, he pulled her inside, slamming the door behind them. "You can still leave," Nicholas said, his voice husky, his restraint evident. Mia took a shaky breath. "I don't want to." That was all it took. The dam burst, and suddenly she was in his arms, her lips crashing against his with a hunger that stole her breath. Nicholas's hands were rough, desperate, as they traced the curves of her body, as if memorizing every inch. He tasted like whiskey and sin, and she let herself drown in him. Their clothes disappeared in a frenzy, discarded carelessly on the marble floor. Nicholas lifted her effortlessly, pressing her against the cold glass window, the city below, oblivious to the fire they ignited that night. His mouth explored her, claiming her in ways no man ever had before. He made her forget the pain, forget the emptiness. Under his touch, she felt alive, needed, wanted, and for one night that was enough. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow over the tangled sheets. Mia stirred, her body sore yet sated, but the warmth she had felt during the night was gone, replaced by an icy chill that sent a different kind of shiver through her. Nicholas stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, already dressed in his crisp suit, his tie half done as he stared out at the city. Something in her chest tightened. He looked distant. She sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice tentative. Nicholas turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Morning." That was it. No tenderness, no lingering glances, just a simple, emotionless greeting. Mia swallowed hard, forcing herself to push away the sudden knot in her stomach. "Last night," she started, unsure of what she wanted to say. Nicholas cut her off, his voice colder than the winter air outside. "Last night was a mistake. A mistake." The words crashed over her like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. She felt foolish, utterly naive for believing that what they shared was anything more than a meaningless encounter. She forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Right, of course." Nicholas turned away, adjusting his tie. "I have a meeting in an hour. Take your time leaving." "Take your time leaving." Mia clenched the sheets tighter. She had expected nothing from him, yet the sharp sting of rejection still cut deep. She forced herself to stand, gathering her clothes with shaking fingers. She dressed quickly, avoiding his gaze, her pride barely holding her together. When she reached the door, she hesitated. A part of her wanted him to stop her, to say something, anything, to prove that she hadn't just been another woman warming his bed for a night. But Nicholas remained silent. Taking a deep breath, Mia opened the door and stepped out, vowing never to cross paths with Nicholas Knight again. Mia Carter sat on the cold bathroom floor, her hands trembling as she stared at the pregnancy test in front of her. 2 pink lines. Her breath hitched, her vision blurring with unshed tears. Number. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. With shaky fingers, she grabbed another test, then another. She'd bought 5, thinking there was no way it could be real. But as she lined them up, each one confirmed the same earth-shattering truth. She was pregnant, with Nicholas Knight's baby. A strangled sob escaped her lips. Her chest heaved, her mind spinning as 1,000 emotions crashed over her. Shock, fear, confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent weeks trying to forget that night, telling herself it meant nothing. Nicholas had made it clear. She was just a mistake to him, a fleeting indulgence in his otherwise controlled life. And now, she was carrying his child. Mia pressed a hand to her stomach, her fingers trembling against her flat belly. There was a life growing inside her, a tiny, innocent life. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the weight of it all sank in. How would she do this alone? She had no stable income, no family to rely on. Her ex-boyfriend had drained her emotionally, leaving her with nothing but scars. And Nicholas, he was ruthless. A man who controlled everything in his world. A man who had looked her in the eye the morning after and called their night together a mistake. What would he do if he found out? Mia shut her eyes tightly, trying to suppress the rising panic. She knew one thing for certain. Nicholas Knight could never find out about this baby. The next few weeks were a blur of overwhelming emotions. Mia buried herself in work, trying to distract herself, but the nausea and fatigue made it nearly impossible. Mornings became battles, running to the bathroom, her body betraying her with relentless sickness. The exhaustion weighed her down, yet she forced herself to push through. She spent hours researching single motherhood, looking for affordable clinics, trying to budget for baby essentials. But no matter how hard she tried, the anxiety never left her. She wasn't ready for this. One evening, as she sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the ultrasound appointment confirmation on her phone, a new wave of fear hit her. Could she really do this alone? She clutched her stomach, whispering, "It's just us, baby, but I promise I'll love you enough for two." A sudden knock at the door startled her. Frowning, she stood and opened it, only to freeze in horror. Nicholas Knight stood there, his imposing frame filling the doorway, his piercing grey eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent her pulse racing. "Mia," he said, his deep voice unreadable. Her heart pounded violently. How? How had he found her? She swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe for support. What are you doing here?" Nicholas studied her, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I've been looking for you." Panic surged through her veins. He couldn't know. He couldn't. Forcing a neutral expression, she crossed her arms. "Why?" Nicholas's jaw tightened. "You disappeared." Mia let out a humorless laugh. "I didn't disappear. I just moved on." His eyes darkened, flicking over her pale face. The dark circles under her eyes, the way she was subtly holding her stomach. Something in his expression shifted. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping forward. Mia instinctively took a step back. "There's nothing to talk about, Nicholas." His gaze turned cold. "I think there is." She knew him too well. He wouldn't let this go. Her breath caught. She had to keep her secret. Whatever happened, Nicholas Knight could never know the truth. But fate had other plans. The dazzling chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom, casting a golden glow over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and polite conversation filled the air, mingling with the soft melody of a live orchestra. The annual Knight Industries Gala was the event of the year, where the elite gathered to flaunt their wealth and power. Mia Carter hadn't wanted to be here. She had spent the last few months hiding, avoiding the one man she feared the most, Nicholas Knight. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. Dressed in a sleek navy blue gown that barely concealed her growing bump, Mia moved cautiously through the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She had only come because her best friend Claire had insisted. "Come on, Mia," Claire had said. "He won't even notice you in a crowd this big." How wrong she had been, the moment she felt the weight of an all-too-familiar gaze burning into her, her breath caught in her throat. She turned her head slightly, her heart nearly stopping when her eyes met Nicholas's piercing grey ones from across the room. Time stood still. He was dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, exuding power and control. His jaw was clenched, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they were filled with something dangerous, something that made her pulse race with fear. Panic surged through her veins. She turned swiftly, moving toward the exit, her fingers gripping the folds of her dress. Run. She had to get out of here before he... A firm, unyielding hand closed around her wrist. Mia gasped, her entire body freezing as she was pulled back. She turned sharply, her heart hammering wildly, as she found herself inches away from Nicholas Knight. His grip was strong, possessive, his touch sending a jolt of awareness through her. His towering presence made it impossible to escape. "You're hiding something, me," he murmured, his deep voice low and laced with suspicion. Mia swallowed hard, trying to keep her breathing steady. "Let me go, Nicholas." His eyes darkened, his fingers tightening slightly around her wrist. "Not until you tell me why you ran the moment you saw me." She forced herself to meet his gaze, masking the terror threatening to consume her. "I didn't run. I was just leaving." A slow, knowing smirk curled his lips, but there was no amusement in his expression. "Lying doesn't suit you, Mia." His gaze flickered downward, lingering for a brief second on the slight curve of her abdomen. Her breath hitched. "No." She tried to step back, but he held her firmly, his eyes narrowed sharp as a blade. "Mia." His voice was dangerously quiet now. "Tell me the truth." She bit her lip, desperately searching for an escape. "There's nothing to tell," she whispered. But the way he was looking at her, he already knew. The realization dawned in his stormy eyes, his grip turning almost possessive. His entire demeanor shifted, his cold exterior cracking just enough to reveal the raw intensity underneath. Without another word, Nicholas grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the ballroom. Mia struggled, trying to resist. "Nicholas, stop! People are watching." "I don't give a damn," he growled, leading her through a private hallway until they reached an empty lounge. The moment the door shut behind them, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Tell me right now," he demanded, his voice laced with something she couldn't decipher. "Are you carrying my child?" Her heart slammed against her ribcage. She had been dreading this moment, had spent months preparing to lie if she ever faced him again. But standing here, trapped in his powerful presence, her strength wavered. Her silence was his answer. Nicholas inhaled sharply, his fists clenching. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his entire body rigid with tension. "How far along?" Mia swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 months. A muscle ticked in his jaw. His grey eyes flickered with emotions too complex to name. 5 months, he repeated, his voice hoarse. "And you didn't think I had the right to know?" She flinched at the accusation, guilt gnawing at her. "I didn't want to trap you, Nicholas. You made it clear that night was a mistake." His expression turned thunderous. "A mistake?" He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Mia, this isn't just about you. That's my child you're carrying." Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And what would you have done if I told you? Forced me into a marriage I don't want? Made me sign some contract so the world doesn't find out about your mistake?" His jaw tightened. "You think so little of me." She let out a bitter laugh. "I think exactly what you've shown me, Nicholas. You don't do emotions. You don't do love. So tell me, what would you have done?" A tense silence stretched between them. Nicholas exhaled heavily, running a hand through his dark hair. He turned away, pacing, his usual controlled exterior fracturing. Mia could see it, the battle within him. Finally, he turned back, his expression unreadable. "You should have told me." Her lips trembled. "And what would you have done, Nicholas?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved toward her, his eyes softer now, conflicted. "This changes everything, Mia." Her breath hitched. What do you mean?" Nicholas Knight was a man who planned every aspect of his life with ruthless precision. A baby had never been part of that plan. But as he stood before her now, his gaze intense and unwavering, he spoke words that sent her world spiraling once again. "You're not doing this alone," he said firmly. "I won't let you." Mia's heart clenched, because for the first time since discovering she was pregnant, she wasn't sure if she should be terrified or relieved. Nicholas Knight wasn't the type of man who accepted surprises, much less the kind that rattled his carefully controlled world. And Mia Carter's pregnancy had done just that, ripped through his life like a storm, leaving him reeling. He had always been a man of control. His empire was built on precision, strategy, and ruthless efficiency. Emotions were a weakness, something he couldn't afford. But now, with Mia standing before him, holding the child they had unknowingly created together, everything he had ever believed about himself felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The news had shattered him. The thought of being a father, of raising a child, was foreign and unsettling. And yet, despite his discomfort, he couldn't ignore the undeniable pull of responsibility that had gripped him when she told him the truth. He wasn't the kind of man to make demands lightly, but this time there was no room for negotiation. Mia's silence, her refusal to lean on him, only pushed him further into a corner. So he issued the coldest, most direct demand he had ever made. "Marry me." Mia stood across from him in his sleek, minimalist office, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with pain, but there was a fire in her that he recognized all too well. She wasn't going to give in. "You don't love me, Nicholas," she said quietly, her voice firm but trembling with unshed tears. "And I won't marry you just because you think it's the right thing to do." He gave her a cold, almost clinical look. "It's not about love, Mia." His tone was sharp, almost indifferent. "It's about responsibility. We're having a child. I'm not going to let you raise our child alone. That's not how this works." Mia's chest tightened with a mixture of frustration and hurt. She knew Nicholas Knight didn't believe in love. It was an inconvenient distraction, a liability in his cutthroat world. But she had hoped, just once, that he might see her for more than the mother of his child. That maybe, just maybe, he would see her as the woman who had shared something real with him. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You're right. You don't love me. And I won't marry you just for the sake of a child. I want more than that, Nicholas. I deserve more than that." His face tightened at the words, but he didn't flinch. Nicholas had never been a man to waste time with explanations, and he wasn't about to start now. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low, almost growling with an underlying anger that seemed to be building within him. Her heart sank as the words hit her. There it was, the cold, ruthless man she had always known. Nicholas Knight was a man who believed in doing things his way, and he wasn't about to let something as messy as emotions stand in the way of what he considered his responsibility. "I'm not asking for your love, Mia," he continued, stepping closer to her, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud. "I'm offering you security, stability, a future for our child. That's the best I can give you." Her breath caught in her throat. "I don't want your money. I don't want your empire. I want you, Nicholas. But you're not capable of giving me that, are you?" His eyes flashed with something unreadable, something fleeting, but he quickly masked it with his usual cold detachment. "I don't love you. I don't know how to love." He spoke with brutal honesty, almost as if the admission didn't matter. "But I will take care of you, and I will take care of our child. And that's the best I can offer." Mia felt her world shift beneath her feet. The coldness in his voice, the finality of his words, it broke her heart. She wanted him to say something different, to tell her that he could change, that he could feel for her the way she had allowed herself to feel for him, but it wasn't going to happen. She turned away, unable to look at him anymore. "I don't need your care, Nicholas. I need your love." A silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. She could feel the tension building in the air, like the calm before a storm. Nicholas stood frozen, his jaw clenched as he processed her words. "Love is a weakness," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know How to give you that. Her heart twisted, the finality of his words echoing in her chest. I don't need you to love me, Nicholas. I just need you to see me, to care about me, not as the mother of your child, but as the woman you once let in. He closed the distance between them, his hand resting on the back of her neck. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down her spine, but it didn't reach her heart. His eyes, though intense, remained distant. I will protect you, Mia, he said, his voice low, a little softer now. And I will protect our child. But if you think I can offer you anything more than that, you're wrong. Her eyes welled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had already given him her heart once, and now she was left with nothing but shattered pieces. I can't do this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't marry a man who doesn't love me. I won't do it for the sake of a child, Nicholas. His eyes darkened, his grip on her tightening slightly as if he couldn't let go. Then I'll move you into my penthouse. I'll make sure you're safe, and I'll make sure you and the baby are taken care of, whether you like it or not. Xia's heart dropped, the finality of his words crashing over her like a wave. She wanted to scream, to tell him she wasn't some helpless woman he could control, but she was pregnant with his child. And in his world, that meant something different. No, Nicholas, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sadness. This isn't how it works. You don't get to take over my life like this. But Nicholas wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't giving her a choice. I don't love you, Mia, he said coldly, but I will do what I must to protect you. And just like that, he had made his decision, and Mia had no choice but to follow. Living under the same roof as Nicholas Knight was a form of torture Mia hadn't anticipated. Every morning, she awoke to the cold, sterile ambiance of his penthouse, the same silence that stretched between them like an impenetrable wall. His presence loomed over her, powerful and commanding, yet emotionally distant. It was like living with a ghost, someone who existed physically, but whose heart was locked away in a place Mia could never reach. At first, the arrangement had seemed like a practical solution. She was pregnant, and Nicholas was determined to ensure her safety, her comfort. He insisted on every little detail, from the security systems in place to the private nurses and doctors he hired to monitor her pregnancy. He wanted to control everything, to ensure she and their child were well taken care of. But it wasn't just that. He wanted to control her, too. Nicholas never gave her any space to breathe. He was always there, always watching, always demanding. Even though he didn't touch her, not in any meaningful way, his presence felt like an invisible force, suffocating her. Every step she took, every decision she made, seemed to be scrutinized by him. Yet, despite his constant surveillance, he remained emotionally absent. He never talked to her about anything that mattered, his past, his feelings, anything of significance. He treated her with an almost clinical detachment, as though their child was the only thing worth his attention. Everything else, her, their shared history, the painful distance between them, was ignored. And yet, there were moments when their gazes lingered longer than they should have, when their bodies brushed against each other, and the air seemed to crackle with an unspoken desire neither one of them could ignore. Mia knew the signs. She had seen them before, in the way his jaw tightened whenever she laughed, in the way his eyes darkened just slightly when she entered the room. It was subtle, but it was there. And as much as she hated the way he treated her, how distant he was, how cold, it didn't change the fact that she still felt drawn to him. She could see the storm inside him, the war between what he wanted and what he thought was best. Tonight, however, was different. Mia had woken up in the middle of the night, a strange craving for something sweet gnawing at her. She slipped out of bed and padded silently into the kitchen, not bothering to check if Nicholas was awake. The penthouse was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. She pulled open the door, reaching for a carton of strawberries. She had no idea why, but the idea of the fruit with chocolate seemed to consume her. As she washed them and began melting the chocolate, the sound of footsteps behind her made her freeze. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel his presence like a dark cloud settling in the room. "What are you doing up?" Nicholas's voice was low, rasping slightly, as if he'd just woken from a deep sleep. She glanced over her shoulder, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. His face was a mask of cool indifference, but his eyes, they were different. There was something in the way they glinted, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "I couldn't sleep," she answered casually, turning back to dip the strawberries into the warm chocolate. She didn't want to admit the reason she was awake was because of him, because she could feel the tension between them like a heavy weight in the room. He stepped closer, and Mia's breath caught in her throat. She tried to focus on the strawberries, but she could feel his presence getting nearer, his heat pressing against her. Nicholas reached for one of the strawberries, his fingers brushing against hers in a moment that felt too intimate. He brought the fruit to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers as he slowly took a bite. There was something almost sensual in the way he ate it, the way he seemed to savor the taste. "Strawberries at midnight," he murmured, his voice thick with something unspoken. "You're full of surprises, Mia." Mia's heart pounded. "I was craving something sweet," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the words felt hollow. Everything about this moment felt like it was spiraling out of control. He stepped closer again, this time his breath warm against her ear as he reached for another strawberry. But instead of just picking it up, he slid his fingers gently across her lips, brushing them with just the slightest touch. Mia froze. Her heart skipped a beat as her pulse raced. His touch was so soft, so lingering, as if he were testing the waters. The air between them seemed to snap with tension. His fingers hovered just a fraction of an inch from her lips, and for the briefest moment she could feel his restraint unraveling. His gaze darkened, his lips parting slightly as if he were struggling to maintain control. "I shouldn't want you," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. There was a roughness in it, a vulnerability that she wasn't sure was meant for her. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly what he was saying. She could feel it, the pull between them, the unspoken attraction that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. He didn't want to want her, but his body was betraying him. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze head-on. "But you do," she whispered, her voice laced with a challenge. "You want me, Nicholas. You always have." For a moment there was silence. Nicholas's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he looked at her with something akin to hunger. He didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped back, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. Mia could feel her own breath catching in her throat, the space between them charged with an electric tension neither of them could ignore. Her heart pounded as she waited for him to do something, anything, to either close the distance between them or walk away entirely. But he didn't walk away. Instead, he simply turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing through the silent penthouse. Mia stood there, still holding the last strawberry in her hand, her pulse racing. Her lips tingled where his fingers had touched, her skin burning with the memory of the moment. She knew, without a doubt, that something had shifted between them, but neither of them had the courage to admit it. Not yet. The storm raged outside, the wind howling as sheets of rain pummeled the windows of the penthouse. Lightning crackled across the sky, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. Inside, the warmth of the fire did little to ease the chill that had settled deep in Mia's bones. She had been out, trying to clear her mind after another day of awkward silence between her and Nicholas. She wasn't sure why she had chosen tonight, of all nights, to take a walk. Perhaps it was because the tension had grown unbearable. The unspoken emotions that swirled between them felt like they were suffocating her. Every time she looked at him, she saw the same cold, detached man who had refused to acknowledge the connection they shared, even though it burned between them like an unstoppable force. But when the rain began to fall, she had been far from home, and the downpour was too heavy for her to seek shelter. She had run, desperate to escape her own thoughts, to lose herself in the rhythm of the storm. But instead, the storm had seemed to follow her, soaking her to the bone and leaving her chilled to the core. By the time she made it back to the penthouse, her body was trembling uncontrollably, her clothes drenched, her hair clinging to her face in wet strands. She had barely made it inside before the door slammed shut behind her, the storm still raging outside. The first thing she saw was Nicholas. His tall, imposing figure was silhouetted by the light of the fire. But for once, there was no harshness in his eyes, no cold indifference, just concern, something she had never expected from him. "Mia." His voice was low, filled with an unexpected tenderness. He was already moving toward her before she could even respond. "What are you doing out there in this weather?" She shook her head, still shivering from the cold. "I just needed to be alone for a little while." His brows furrowed as he took in her state, her wet clothes, her chattering teeth, the faint shivers that racked her body. Without another word, he quickly grabbed a thick, soft blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her gently into his warmth. His fingers brushed against her damp skin, sending a shiver up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. For the briefest moment their gazes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. It was as if the universe had pushed them into this moment, an undeniable force pulling them together despite all the walls they had built. Mia could feel the heat of his body near hers, but it wasn't the heat she craved. It was him. She wanted him, wanted to feel his touch, his embrace. But most of all, she wanted to understand why he couldn't let her in, why he kept pulling away, even when she could feel the electricity between them, sparking with every word, every glance, every lingering moment. Nicholas seemed to hesitate, his fingers still, lightly brushing against the damp skin of her arm, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to let go. His breath came heavier now, his chest rising and falling with the intensity of the moment. "I should have never let you out in this storm," he murmured, his voice gruff, as if he were trying to steady himself. "You could have gotten sick." But Mia wasn't listening to his words. She was lost in the raw, tangible energy that swirled around them. The way his eyes darkened as he stared at her, the way his lips parted slightly as if he were struggling to control himself. The desire in his gaze was undeniable, even if he wasn't willing to admit it to himself, or to her. And that's when it happened. Without warning, Nicholas's hands cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek as if testing the waters, feeling the heat of her skin beneath his touch. He leaned down, and before Mia could even react, his lips crashed into hers, urgent and desperate, as if all the months of restraint had come undone in that single heated kiss. Her mind reeled in shock, and for a second she wasn't sure if she could trust what was happening. This was Nicholas, distant, cold Nicholas, the man who had built walls around his heart that no one could scale. And yet here he was, kissing her with a fire that spoke of everything unsaid between them. She responded instantly, her arms wrapping around him, pulling him closer. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she pressed her body against his, feeling the hard muscles of his chest beneath his shirt, the warmth of his skin flooding her senses. His kiss deepened, a mix of hunger and longing, and suddenly the world outside seemed so far away. There was only the two of them, caught in the storm of their own making. His hands slid down her back, pressing her even closer as the kiss grew more intense, more desperate. He tasted like rain and desire, like everything she had been holding back, and for a brief moment she let go of all the pain, all the heartache. She let herself drown in him, but just as quickly as it had begun, Nicholas pulled away. His eyes were darker now, filled with something raw and unfiltered, something that scared her. She could feel the distance returning, the walls he had so carefully constructed rising again between them. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice low and ragged, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. He stepped back, running a hand through his damp hair, as if trying to regain control of himself. Mia's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to scream, to demand more from him, but instead, all she could do was stare at him, her breath catching in her throat. It didn't change anything. He had kissed her with a passion that could have set the world on fire, and yet it meant nothing to him. To him, it was just another moment of weakness, something to be dismissed, something to be buried beneath the same cold exterior he had shown her all along. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you kiss me if you're just going to pull away again?" Nicholas didn't answer right away. His chest rose and fell with every breath, and for a moment he looked almost defeated. "I'm not the man you think I am, Mia," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I can't give you what you want. I can't love you the way you need." His words were a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of everything she had hoped for, everything she had wanted from him. Mia's heart ached, but she refused to let him see how deeply his rejection had cut. "Then why don't you just let me go?" she whispered. "If I'm not what you want, then stop pretending." His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but then he turned away, walking toward the door, leaving her standing there, alone in the cold, the heat of their kiss still burning on her lips. And in that moment, Mia realized that no matter how much she loved him, no matter how much she needed him to return the feeling, Nicholas Knight would never give her what she wanted. Not now. Not ever. The storm raged on outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm that raged inside her heart. Mia had started to believe in something she hadn't dared to allow herself to feel before. A sliver of hope had begun to take root in her heart, a tiny seed of belief that maybe, just maybe, Nicholas could change. Maybe the walls around him were starting to crumble. It was late afternoon when the doorbell rang, breaking the fragile calm that had settled between them. Mia was in the kitchen, humming quietly as she prepared dinner, her growing belly a reminder of the life they had created together. Nicholas had been more present than usual. He had started to touch her more, hold her gaze for longer than necessary. He had even started talking to her about their future, carefully, cautiously, but still, it felt like a step forward. At first, she thought it was just another one of his business associates arriving for a meeting, or a scheduled visit. But when she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a woman, tall, poised, and impossibly elegant, wearing a smile that could cut glass. "Vivian." Nicholas's voice was colder than usual when he emerged from the hallway, his posture stiffening at the sight of the woman standing in their doorway. Mia felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. Vivian, his former fiancée, the woman from his past. Mia tried not to let the panic show on her face, but the moment she laid eyes on Vivian, a knot formed in her stomach. There was something about the woman, the way she carried herself, the way she looked at Nicholas with an almost possessive smile, that made Mia feel small in comparison. Vivian's eyes flicked over Mia with a disdainful glance before focusing solely on Nicholas. "So, this is where you've been hiding," she said, her voice silky with an edge of condescension. "I had to see it for myself." Mia's heart thudded in her chest as she watched the way Nicholas's expression hardened, the lines of tension creeping into his face. He didn't move to introduce them. Instead, he just stood there, silent, his eyes flicking back and forth between the two women, unsure of what to do next. "Vivian," he finally said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" Vivian smiled, a sly, knowing smile that seemed to be hiding some secret only she understood. She stepped forward, ignoring Mia completely, and placed a gentle hand on Nicholas's arm. "I came to see if you're really going to throw everything away for her," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Mia's breath caught in her throat, and she couldn't help but take a step back. She didn't know what she had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. This woman standing in front of her, as if she had every right to be there. Vivian's gaze shifted back to Mia, her eyes sharp and calculating. "You think Nicholas will ever love you?" she sneered, the venom in her words unmistakable. "He's incapable of love, Mia. You're just a placeholder, a woman carrying his child out of some misguided sense of responsibility, nothing more." Mia's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the words sunk in. She had known, deep down, that Nicholas's affection might not be the passionate, all-consuming kind of love she'd hoped for. She'd accepted that he wasn't the type of man to easily give his heart. But this, hearing Vivian say it so bluntly with such finality, something inside her cracked. Was she just a placeholder? A convenient option until Nicholas's past could resurface and reclaim him? The thoughts twisted in her mind like a knot tightening around her chest. She looked at Nicholas, searching for some hint of defense, some indication that he would stand up for her, that he would contradict Vivian's cruel words, but instead she saw only the same cool detachment in his eyes. His silence was deafening. Mia's breath hitched. She didn't want to believe it, but his silence spoke volumes. It was as though he had heard those same words before from someone else, in another time. Maybe Vivian was right. Maybe she was just carrying his child, and that was all she would ever be to him. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't let Vivian, this woman from Nicholas's past, tear her apart like this. She had to hold on to her dignity, her self-respect. Mia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't think we've been properly introduced," she said, her voice calm but laced with an underlying tension. She extended her hand toward Vivian, her smile polite but strained. Vivian, for her part, didn't seem in the least bit intimidated by Mia's attempt at civility. She didn't even acknowledge Mia's hand. Instead, she smirked, her eyes flicking back to Nicholas. "You really think she's the one, don't you?" Vivian's voice was full of mockery, but there was a raw bitterness to it that Mia hadn't anticipated. "Mia," Nicholas finally said, his voice flat, "please excuse me for a moment." He turned, his hand gently resting on her shoulder as if it was a rehearsed move. Mia's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't turn to look at him. She couldn't. There was something in the way he had said it, the way he had practically dismissed her, that sent an ache through her chest. The two of them stepped out of the room, leaving Mia standing in the doorway. She felt like an intruder in her own home, a silent witness to a part of Nicholas's past that she had never known, a past that seemed to haunt him even now. She didn't know how long they were gone. The minutes felt like hours, the silence in the room stretching taut like a tightrope. Mia paced back and forth, fighting the gnawing sense of doubt that had taken root in her heart, and when Nicholas returned, there was nothing comforting in his gaze. He didn't seem to notice the way Mia was standing, the way she was holding herself, trying to appear stronger than she felt. His eyes flicked over her, and for a brief moment Mia thought she saw something in them, something like regret or perhaps guilt. But he didn't say anything. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice low and barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry you had to meet her like that." He looked away, as if he were uncomfortable with the emotions that had begun to stir inside him. But Mia couldn't hold back anymore. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You never told me about her. You never told me how much she meant to you. You never told me that she would still be a part of your life, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to remind me that I'm not enough." Nicholas's jaw tightened at her words, and for the first time Mia saw something flicker in his eyes. A glimpse of fear. Fear that she might be right. Fear that the life they were building together, everything they had shared, might not be enough to heal the scars of his past. But he said nothing. The silence that followed hung heavy between them, thicker than ever. Mia realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that Nicholas had no intention of giving her the reassurance she so desperately needed. He wasn't going to fight for her, and in that moment Mia felt it. His silence, more painful than any words could ever be. It was the quiet acceptance of a truth she had feared all along. She was, in the end, just another woman in his life. A woman who would never be enough to truly change him. Mia's heart was heavy with a decision she never thought she would have to make. But standing there in the silence of their penthouse, staring at the man who had promised nothing more than a cold, practical arrangement, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't stay. She had tried. She had wanted to believe that there was some hidden depth in Nicholas, some place within him where love might grow, but every day spent in his world of ice and silence had chipped away at her hope. She had convinced herself that she could make it work, for the baby, for the life they were supposed to build together. But in the end, it wasn't just the lack of love that hurt. It was the lie he had told her all along, that he cared for her, even in the smallest, most fleeting of ways. He never did. And she couldn't stay pretending that she could. Mia left before dawn, slipping quietly from the penthouse, taking only what she needed, her clothes, her essentials, and a few cherished memories she had packed away over the months. She left a note for Nicholas, though it was more for herself than for him. She needed to explain her decision, but no words could ever truly explain the heartbreak she felt. So she simply wrote, "I'm sorry, but I can't stay in a life that isn't real. I hope you understand." And then she was gone. For weeks, she hid from the world, from him. She went far away to a quiet coastal town far from the busy city to find peace and clarity. There, amidst the endless horizon and the sound of the crashing waves, she began to live again. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was real. It was hers. She found work in a small cafe on the edge of town, brewing coffee, serving pastries, and living as simply as she could. The people there were kind, their smiles genuine, and they didn't ask too many questions. They didn't know her past, and she was okay with that. The town felt like a new beginning, like a fresh start. Her heart was healing slowly but surely, and she was learning to be content with the quiet rhythm of her days. But Nicholas had a way of finding people when they didn't want to be found. The phone calls stopped coming. The emails ceased. But his presence was persistent in a way that made her pulse race with both dread and longing. It happened on a day that was like any other. Mia was wiping down a counter when she heard the bell above the door jingle, signaling a new customer. She didn't think much of it until she saw him, Nicholas, standing in the doorway of her cafe, soaked to the bone from the torrential downpour outside, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto hers. His face, usually so controlled and unreadable, was now clouded with something that might have been desperation. He looked like a man who had lost everything and was willing to tear the world apart to get it back. He stormed inside, his wet coat clinging to his broad shoulders as he took slow, deliberate steps toward her. He was towering, as always, but today he looked different, angrier. His jaw was tight, his brows furrowed, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that unsettled Mia as he approached. "You think you can just leave?" His voice was rough, thick with emotion, something he had never allowed her to see before. "You think you can just walk away from me? From everything?" Mia didn't move, didn't flinch, though her heart hammered in her chest. The last place she ever wanted to be was face to face with him again. But there he was, demanding answers, demanding more of her than she could give. She squared her shoulders and looked him in the eye, trying to steady her breath. "You never gave me a reason to stay," she said, her voice steady, though it trembled inside. The words came out sharper than she intended, but they were the truth. She had tried so many times to convince herself that staying was worth it, that he could change, that he would care. But he never did, not in the way she needed him to. Nicholas's expression faltered for a fraction of a second, his chest rising and falling with the weight of her words. There was a flicker of pain in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by the coldness that had been so familiar to her. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then he stopped, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words that would convince her to come back. "You think I wanted this?" he finally growled, his voice low and filled with frustration. He took a step toward her, his presence suffocating. "I didn't want you to leave. You think I didn't care? You think I didn't try to change, to give you everything you needed?" Mia wanted to laugh, but the sound that left her was more of a sad, hollow breath. She couldn't look at him, not without feeling the sting of everything that had come before. The lies, the silence, the absence of love. She had given him everything she had, and he had given her nothing but distance. "If you really cared," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you would have shown me. You would have let me in." His brow furrowed in confusion as though her words didn't make sense to him. "I didn't know how, Mia. You think it's easy for me. I've never—" "No." She cut him off, shaking her head. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep waiting for you to realize what's right in front of you. I'm not asking for grand gestures, Nicholas. Just for you to see me. To see us." Her hand went to her stomach instinctively as she added, "I'm carrying your child, and you still can't bring yourself to care." The words stung, and she could see his face twitch with the force of her confession, but still he remained silent. The silence between them stretched, thick and oppressive. Mia took a deep breath and stepped back, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. She couldn't stay in his world anymore. It was toxic, filled with his lies and his empty promises. She had to protect herself and the child growing inside her. "You never gave me a reason to stay," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "And now I can't." Nicholas opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. He stood there, staring at her with a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and something else, something that looked suspiciously like regret. But it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Knight was speechless. Mia turned away, heading toward the back of the cafe, her heart aching with every step she took. She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze on her, heavy and desperate, but she wouldn't be swayed. She had already made her decision, and she wasn't running away from him anymore. She was running toward a life that was truly hers, one where she could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of his lies. The night began like any other. The coastal town was wrapped in an eerie silence, the only sound the soft lapping of the waves against the shore. Mia had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the solitude, but tonight something felt different. She had been feeling faint, light-headed throughout the day, but she chalked it up to stress. The pregnancy, the emotions, and the constant ache of her heart, it was all becoming overwhelming. She had just finished cleaning up the cafe after closing when a sharp, sudden pain shot through her lower abdomen. She gasped, clutching the edge of the counter for support, but the pain intensified, spreading like wildfire through her body. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, unable to keep herself upright. Panic set in. She barely had time to process what was happening before her knees buckled beneath her. The ground rushed up to meet her, and everything went black. When she awoke, the first thing she noticed was the sterile scent of a hospital room. Her head throbbed, and her body felt heavy, as though she'd been pulled through a storm. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, forcing her back down. The soft sound of breathing reached her ears, and she turned her head slightly. To her surprise, she saw Nicholas sitting by her bedside, his face drawn with exhaustion, his hand firmly holding hers. He looked almost fragile. His usual confidence, the impenetrable wall he always built around himself, was gone. His hair was damp with sweat, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes, those cold, emotionless eyes, were filled with something Mia couldn't quite place. Mia's throat tightened as she tried to speak, but her voice came out weak and hoarse. "Nicholas," she whispered, her breath catching. His gaze snapped to hers, and for a moment she saw the full weight of his fear, something so raw and vulnerable that it made her heart twist. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at her with wide, frantic eyes, as though he couldn't believe she was really there, that she was alive. He squeezed her hand tighter, his thumb brushing across her skin in a nervous, almost frantic motion. "You're awake," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Thank God. I thought—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought, his breath catching in his throat. Mia's mind raced as she tried to piece together the events that had led to this moment. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You collapsed," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know what to do. I called an ambulance. I thought I'd lost you." She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She could see the toll the fear had taken on him, the way his shoulders sagged, as though the relief of her waking was the only thing keeping him upright. For the first time, Nicholas Knight seemed human. He was no longer the cold, ruthless CEO who could dismantle a company without blinking an eye. Now he was just a man, vulnerable, shaken, and, as she would soon learn, full of guilt and regret. Mia reached out with her free hand, touching his arm lightly. "I'm fine," she said softly, trying to reassure him. But there was something in his expression, something that made her realize that her safety hadn't been the only thing weighing on him. His eyes flickered down to their hands, then back up to her face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He seemed to be struggling, as though he were trying to find the right thing to say, but couldn't quite manage it. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't know how to love," he admitted, his words cutting through the quiet air like a blade. "I've never known how. All I know is how to build walls, to push people away, but when I thought I might lose you—" His breath hitched and his eyes glazed over, as if the memory of that moment was still too raw. "When I thought I might lose you, I realized I can't live without you." Mia's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. Nicholas Knight, the man who had spent so long rejecting everything that wasn't cold logic and calculated control, was admitting something she never thought she'd hear. I need you, Mia," he continued, his voice trembling now, the facade he had worked so hard to maintain crumbling around him. His eyes locked onto hers, and she could see the desperation there. "I've spent my whole life running from anything that might make me vulnerable, anything that might make me feel, but when I thought you were gone—" He paused, his chest rising and falling rapidly with emotion. "I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, I couldn't—" His voice faltered, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she saw him, truly saw him, stripped of all pretense. Mia's heart ached as she watched him, realizing the magnitude of what he was saying. Nicholas Knight was afraid of losing her, afraid of letting someone in, afraid of feeling something he couldn't control. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to be this way. But I—" He shook his head, as if the words were too difficult to say. "I don't know how to love, Mia. I don't know how to fix this, but when I thought I might lose you—" Tears filled Mia's eyes as she looked at him, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Despite everything, despite the distance, despite the hurt, despite the walls he had built between them, Nicholas had finally realized something that she had known all along, something that had been growing inside her for months. He loved her, not in the way she had hoped, not in the grand gestures she had dreamed of, but in the way that only someone who had been broken could understand. He loved her in the quiet moments, in the vulnerability that he had been too afraid to show. Mia squeezed his hand, her own tears now falling freely. She didn't say anything at first, just held his gaze, letting him see the depth of her own emotions. She had loved him for so long, even when he didn't love her back, even when it seemed impossible. And now, in this moment, he was telling her everything she had hoped to hear. "That's what love is, Nicholas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not about being perfect. It's about knowing the other person, the raw, broken, beautiful parts of them. It's about being there for each other, no matter what." Nicholas stared at her, his expression softening, the weight of her words sinking in. He seemed to be processing everything, as though the truth of what she was saying was finally reaching him. He had spent his life thinking that love was something he could control, something he could avoid. But now, with Mia, he was learning that love wasn't something you could control. It was messy, complicated, and often painful, but it was also beautiful. Mia pulled him closer, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and joy. She had never imagined that this moment would come, but now that it had, she knew that everything had changed. And for the first time in their relationship, Nicholas leaned in, resting his forehead against hers, as if he were grounding himself in the truth of her words, in the truth of their love. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he murmured. "I'm sorry for pushing you away, for making you feel like you didn't matter. But you do, Mia. You matter more than anything." Mia smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know," she whispered, her voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't thought possible. "I know, Nicholas. I've always known." And in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet hospital room, Mia realized that this was the beginning of something new, something beautiful, something real, because love wasn't about perfection. It was about finding the strength to let go of the walls you had built around yourself and letting someone in. And in that moment, Nicholas had finally let her in. It had been months since Nicholas's vulnerable confession in the hospital, and though their relationship had slowly transformed, something lingered in the air. The tension of uncertainty was still present, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where Mia could feel that something was different. He had let down some of his walls, slowly but surely, and he had come to show her in his own way that he was trying. Still, Nicholas had never spoken of the future. They lived day to day, navigating the complexities of their relationship, the baby growing inside Mia, and the undeniable pull between them. Nicholas, always the guarded man, had never allowed himself to speak of anything beyond the present. He had never voiced what it was he truly wanted, even as his feelings for Mia deepened. She was still unsure of whether he truly loved her, or if he was simply trying to be responsible. One warm evening in late spring, Mia found herself sitting in the garden of their penthouse. The golden glow of the setting sun cast soft shadows across the flowers, the fragrance of jasmine and roses filling the air. The city was alive, but up here it felt as though time had slowed. She sat on a bench, her thoughts drifting from one thing to another: life, love, the future. She was at peace, but there was a part of her that still longed for more. More from Nicholas, more from herself, more from their life together. The soft click of the door behind her startled her from her reverie, and she turned to find Nicholas standing there. His usual commanding presence was softened by the way the sunlight caught his features, making him seem almost human. His gaze was intense, but there was something different about it, something she couldn't quite place. "Are you just going to stand there?" Mia asked, a teasing smile playing on her lips. Nicholas's lips twitched into a small, uncertain smile, but he didn't answer. He simply walked toward her, his footsteps slow, deliberate. As he reached her, Mia's heart began to race. Something in the air had shifted. She could feel the intensity building between them, something she had never quite felt before. A shift in the balance. Without a word, Nicholas knelt before her, lowering himself onto one knee. Mia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had never expected to come, the moment she had never truly dared to dream of. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the world seeming to quiet around them. Nicholas's eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw complete vulnerability in them. The walls that had always been so carefully constructed were gone, replaced by an openness that took her breath away. Nicholas took a deep breath, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "Mia," he began, the sound of her name on his lips almost like a prayer. "I was a fool. I spent so long trying to control everything, trying to keep myself distant, thinking that love was a weakness. But what I didn't realize is that love is everything. It's you. It's always been you." Mia's chest tightened as his words settled into her heart. She could feel the weight of them, the sincerity, the pain, and the love that he was finally admitting. His hand moved to his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box, and her heart pounded even faster. He opened it, revealing a stunning diamond ring, its brilliance almost blinding in the soft light of the sunset. "I'm done being a coward, Mia," Nicholas continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so long running from the truth, running from what I feel for you, but I can't keep doing it. I can't imagine a life without you. Not without your love, not without our family, not without the future we can build together. I'm asking you, not because of our child, though that's a part of it. but because I love you. I always have, and I always will." Mia felt her breath catch in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Nicholas Knight, this man who had always been so afraid of love, so unwilling to let anyone in, was kneeling before her, offering her not just a ring, but his heart, his future, everything. Her eyes filled with tears, and her hands trembled as she reached for the ring, the words barely escaping her lips. "Nicholas, I don't know what to say." He smiled, a rare, soft smile that made his eyes light up. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his voice full of sincerity. "Just say yes. Say yes to the life we can have together. Say yes to us. I don't need anything else." Mia's emotions swirled inside her, a whirlwind of love, joy, and overwhelming gratitude. She had never imagined this moment, never thought that the man who had once been so distant, so untouchable, would stand here before her, asking her to be his forever. But in that moment, she realized that everything they had been through, the pain, the misunderstandings, the moments of distance, had led to this. It had led to a place where they could truly be together, where they could start again, as partners, as equals, as a family. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Nicholas, I'll marry you. I'll be yours forever." The words hung in the air like magic, and Nicholas's face broke into a grin, a mixture of relief and joy. He stood up, pulling her into his arms with a tenderness that took her breath away. His lips found hers in a kiss that was soft at first, filled with the weight of everything they had both been through. But then it deepened, their passion surging to the surface as if they couldn't hold back anymore, as if this moment, this promise, was all they had ever needed. When they finally broke apart, Mia looked up at him, her heart full, her eyes shining. She saw everything in him now, everything he had kept hidden, everything he had been too afraid to show. She saw the love in his eyes, raw and real, and it was more than she had ever dreamed of. "I love you," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I've always loved you." Nicholas brushed a stray tear from her cheek, his gaze softening. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "and I love you, Mia. I always have." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It was a new dawn for both of them. A future they would build together, hand in hand, no longer running from love, but embracing it fully without fear. For Nicholas, the man who had once been afraid of feeling, had now found the one thing that mattered most, a love that would carry him through everything. And for Mia, the woman who had once feared that she would never be enough, she now knew that she was everything to him. The ring on her finger glittered in the fading light, a symbol of their promise, a promise that everything had changed and nothing would ever be the same again. And in that moment, as they kissed again, surrounded by the golden hues of the sunset, Mia knew that this was the beginning of the rest of their lives. Together, forever. The wedding was small, intimate, and far from the grandiose affairs that Nicholas was accustomed to planning. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no dazzling decorations, no flashing lights or roaring crowds. Instead, it was a quiet affair, held in the garden of their coastal retreat, with only close friends and family present. A few simple chairs arranged in the grass, a table of flowers, and a beautiful archway made of ivy and white roses. This was the setting for the beginning of their new life together. Mia had never imagined her wedding would be like this, modest, serene, and personal, but somehow it was perfect. It reflected everything their relationship had become. It was about the small, meaningful moments, The quiet moments where love grew, where promises were made, and where hearts opened up to each other in the most vulnerable of ways. As Mia walked down the aisle, her heart raced. Not from nerves, but from the overwhelming realization of how far they had come. She had once been unsure of this man who had captured her heart with his cold indifference, his emotional walls, and his arrogance. She had never believed he was capable of love, never imagined she would be the one to break through those walls. But here she was, walking toward him, the man who had transformed before her eyes. Nicholas wasn't the same ruthless CEO who had dismissed her all those months ago. He had changed. He had become the man she had always hoped he could be. A man who loved her with a depth that she had never imagined possible. A man who was willing to put everything on the line for their family. A man who, in the most tender of ways, showed her every single day that he was committed to her, heart and soul. When she reached the altar, Nicholas's eyes met hers, and the look in them took her breath away. There was no detachment, no calculating gaze that once seemed to measure her worth. Instead, there was nothing but adoration, affection, and an emotion so deep that Mia felt as though she might drown in it. She could see the love shining in his eyes, and it made her heart swell. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a promise to be together, no matter what the future held. The vows they exchanged were simple, but they meant everything. Nicholas's voice was steady, but there was a hint of emotion, a rawness that hadn't been there before. "I've never been good at this," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to try. I want to try to be the man you deserve. I want to be the husband you've always dreamed of, and the father our child needs. I've never known love like this, Mia. I've never known a love that changes you, that makes you want to be a better man every single day. But with you, I've learned how to love, and I will love you for the rest of my life." Mia's heart was in her throat, her chest tight with emotion. She had never expected to hear such words from him, not in a million years. The Nicholas she had first met would have never said something like this. But now, standing before her, he was not just the man she had fallen for, he was the man she had always known he could be. The man who was willing to face his fears, to open his heart, and to commit to her fully. When it was her turn to speak, she could barely get the words out through the tears that threatened to fall. "I've spent so many years trying to protect myself, trying to keep my heart from breaking. But you, Nicholas, you made me believe in something I never thought possible. You made me believe in love again. I promise to love you for as long as I live, to support you, and to be the mother our child deserves. Together, we can overcome anything." As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Mia was overwhelmed by the wave of emotions that washed over her. She had never imagined she would find love like this, not with someone like Nicholas. She had spent so long running from the idea of love, afraid that it would only lead to heartache. But now, with him, she realized that love wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, something that made her stronger, something that gave her hope for the future. Nicholas pulled her into his arms as the guests cheered, and in that moment, everything felt perfect. The world seemed to disappear, and there was nothing but the two of them. The kiss they shared was slow, tender, and full of promise. It wasn't a passionate kiss, filled with the heat of desire. It was a kiss that conveyed everything they had both been through, everything they had survived, and everything they had become. From that moment on, their life together was nothing like she had ever imagined. Their days were filled with quiet mornings in bed, their laughter filling the rooms of their home as they awaited the arrival of their child. Nicholas had proven to be a devoted husband, one who had truly transformed. He wasn't the man who had once used his power to control everything around him. He had become a man who cherished the little moments, the quiet evenings spent with Mia, and the anticipation of becoming a father. Every night, after a long day, Nicholas would kneel by the side of her bed, placing his hand gently on her growing belly. "I can't wait to meet you," he would whisper to their unborn child, his voice full of wonder. His fingers would caress her skin, and Mia could feel the tenderness in his touch, a softness that she'd never thought possible for a man like him. She would watch him, her heart swelling with love, knowing that he was already the perfect father. He no longer needed to prove anything to her. His love for her and their child was evident in everything he did, from the way he would rush home after work to spend time with her, to the way he would insist on picking her up from her doctor's appointments, even when he was busy with meetings and obligations. He made her feel like she was his priority, and in return, Mia gave him her heart without hesitation. There were no more walls between them, no more doubts, no more fears. Nicholas had finally opened his heart to her, and she had done the same. Together they had created something beautiful, a love that had overcome all odds. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, watching the sunset over the ocean, Nicholas turned to her, his eyes full of emotion. "You're everything to me, Mia," he said, his voice soft but filled with intensity. "I never knew it was possible to feel like this. But with you, I feel complete." Mia smiled through the tears that filled her eyes, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never thought she would be here, sitting beside the man she had once feared would never love her, knowing that they were building something that was unbreakable. She took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I love you, Nicholas," she whispered. "I always have, and I always will." And as they sat there, hand in hand, watching the world change with the setting sun, Mia knew that their love would continue to grow, that it would be tested, but it would always stand strong. Because love, the kind they had found, was unstoppable. It was built on trust, on transformation, on sacrifice, and on a deep, unshakable connection that neither of them would ever let go. Together, they had found the love they both deserved. Together, they had created a future that was worth fighting for. And as Nicholas pressed a kiss to her forehead, Mia closed her eyes, knowing that their story was only just beginning. The day Mia went into labor was unlike any other. The anticipation in the air was thick. The hours stretched long as she clutched Nicholas's hand, breathing through the contractions. The pain was intense, but every time she looked at him, she found strength. Nicholas, once the cool, composed CEO, was now fully present, his face etched with concern and love as he stood by her side. He had been through many high-stakes business deals, had faced dangerous negotiations, and had stared down countless adversaries, but none of those moments had prepared him for this. The moment that truly mattered, the moment when his life would change forever, when he would hold in his arms the person who would mean more to him than anything else in the world. Mia's breath caught as another wave of pain rolled through her. Nicholas leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "You're doing great," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're almost there." It felt as though the world had narrowed down to just the two of them in that room. The sterile walls, the beeping machines, the bustling nurses, they all faded into the background. There was only the sound of Mia's breath and the soft beat of his own heart. Time seemed to stand still in the final moments. Mia's grip tightened on his hand, her face contorted with pain, but she kept her eyes locked on his. The connection between them unbreakable. Nicholas's mind raced. He had been through so much to get here, so many moments of self-doubt and fear that had kept him at a distance. But now, watching Mia give everything for their child, he felt something shift inside him, something deep and raw. And then, finally, the room was filled with the sound of a newborn's cry. Nicholas's heart skipped a beat. The rush of emotions was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The nurse carefully placed their baby into Mia's arms, and for a moment, everything stood still. Mia's eyes welled up with tears as she gazed down at their son, her face a mixture of exhaustion, awe, and overwhelming love. But Nicholas, he couldn't look away. He was paralyzed, his breath caught in his throat. This tiny life, this tiny person, was theirs. He had never known anything like this before, not in business, not in any deal, not in any victory. This was something beyond anything he had ever imagined. The nurse gently handed the baby to him, and as Nicholas cradled their son, a wave of emotion washed over him. His hands, once steady and sure in the world of finance and power, trembled as he held the fragile, perfect little being. His mind went blank, his usual sharp thoughts stilled by the overwhelming magnitude of the moment. "You're perfect," Nicholas whispered to his son, his voice trembling, and for the first time in his life he didn't try to hide it. His eyes moved from the tiny face in his arms to Mia, her expression radiant with love and pride. He didn't have to say anything more. She understood. She always did. The baby's small hand reached out, his tiny fingers curling around Nicholas's finger, and in that moment, something inside him shifted completely. He had spent his life building walls, pushing people away, avoiding vulnerability, believing that love was a weakness, something that could be exploited or used against him. But as he looked down at his son, holding him so tenderly, he realized the truth. Love had never been a weakness. It had made him stronger. Love had made him whole. Love had brought him to this moment, and it was the one thing that would hold them all together through whatever the future might bring. Nicholas looked at Mia again, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it felt like it might burst from his chest. "Just like your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion, unable to stop the tears that welled up in his eyes. Mia's gaze softened as she wiped her tears away. She reached out for their son, gently taking him from Nicholas's arms, and their son's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, the baby gazed up at them, his tiny face calm and peaceful, as if he knew he was loved by two people who would do anything for him. This was their family. This was everything they had worked for. This was what they had fought for. As Mia held their son close, Nicholas stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder, feeling as though a new chapter of his life was beginning. There were no more walls, no more fears, no more reservations. There was only love, love for Mia, love for their child, and love for the family they would build together. The hours that followed were a blur. They both marveled at their son, taking turns holding him, whispering promises of love, of protection, and of devotion. Nicholas, once the emotionally distant man who had never allowed himself to truly feel, now found himself completely immersed in the quiet moments with his family. Every kiss on their son's forehead, every soft whisper into his tiny ear, only solidified what Nicholas had already known deep in his heart. Mia smiled at him, her exhaustion tempered by the joy of their new life together. "He's everything," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder as she looked at their son. Nicholas nodded, his heart too full to speak. He had never understood the depth of that statement until now. It was a truth that had suddenly become crystal clear to him. Later that evening, when they were alone, just the three of them in the quiet hospital room. Nicholas lay beside Mia as she rested with their son cradled between them. The world outside seemed so far away, and for the first time in years, Nicholas felt as though he could breathe. The weight of his past, of his business, his mistakes, his fear, felt light, as if it had all been washed away by this tiny miracle. He kissed the top of Mia's head, his fingers gently tracing her hand as she slept. His son's soft breathing filled the space around them, a peaceful rhythm that was now the heart of their family. Nicholas closed his eyes, feeling something inside him solidify, a certainty that he hadn't had before. This was the beginning of everything. And when he finally whispered, "I love you both," the words came easily, because in that moment he realized that love wasn't just something he felt. It was something he had built, something he had created, something that would carry him, Mia, and their son through every obstacle that came their way. Love had made him stronger. Love had shattered his past and made him whole. And now, with Mia by his side and their son in his arms, he was ready to spend forever proving it. This was their new beginning. And no matter what the future held, Nicholas knew one thing for sure. Love would always guide them. Always.